Hello, and welcome to Tideline's Compass series on impact investing. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Jane Bieneman, Senior Advisor at Tideline. I'll be joined in moderating today's session by my colleague, Claudia Leon. And before I introduce our terrific panelists, I'm pleased to introduce Claudia, who is Tideline's Climate Practice Lead. Claudia spearheads our work in climate, both in terms of activities with clients as well as our thought leadership. And this includes our just published white paper, Truth and Climate Impact, which Claudia co-authored. And in this paper, we explore what it means to be a climate impact investor, both in terms of strategy, as well as a number of more operational and implementation considerations. So I am very happy to turn it over to Claudia for a brief introduction to the paper and our conversation today. So over to you, Claudia.
Thanks, Jane. Really excited to be talking about this very important topic here today. I'll give a quick intro into the paper. I think really the impetus for this paper was born out of the increased demand and attention around climate impact investing. And as we detailed in the paper, I think we've seen that the breadth of climate action is quite broad. So it spans everywhere from negative screening to thematic investing to more focused impact investing strategies. And at the same time, we're seeing not just impact investors, but all investors, whether they have a climate focus or not, maturing in their practices for assessing and managing climate risks, mostly in the form of ESG practices. So really the question that we began to think of as a team was, as investors all kind of become increasingly aware of the need to manage for these environmental and climate factors. And more importantly, as investors are becoming more vocal in claiming environmental impact, how can we identify those investors that are doing climate investing well? And by that, we mean kind of with focus and rigor and a layer of accountability. So as we began to put our heads together on this topic, we kept coming back to the three principles that we laid out in a report that we published last year called Truth and Impact. And in that report, really we lay out these three core pillars that distinguish impact investors, those three pillars being intentionality, contribution, and measurement. And in the first iteration of that Truth and Impact paper, we predominantly focused on the first two pillars of intentionality and contribution, which are the left columns here. And we touched on measurement, but not to the extent that we did in this white paper. So with intentionality, we're really referring to the level of focus and clarity in investment strategies. So does the manager have kind of a clear understanding of the goals and their strategy, and have they put time into kind of understanding the challenge and specific opportunity set? And within the climate space, we found it increasingly important for investors to kind of discern and communicate precisely the type of outcomes that they're pursuing through their strategies. And we find that bringing specificity to the thesis and those strategies is really important and comes to life through the types of ways in which investors then implement those strategies. The second pillar, contribution, speaks to the role that investors play in enabling and advancing the achievement of impact outcomes. And often in climate investing, we find that there's kind of this layer of operational expertise and climate expertise that's required. So for instance, in kind of transition investing, managers need to be quite hands-on in setting targets and working with their companies. And in climate tech, investors obviously play a critical role in helping those companies scale. And as I mentioned in this paper, we also bring measurement more into focus. So with climate investing specifically, we find that there's both this opportunity and challenge to get more quantitative with the measurement of impact outcomes. So for instance, we find that there's this focus on measurement across the landscape, specifically in scope 1 through 3 emissions. But what we bring to light in the paper is that really climate impact investors differentiate themselves by having more of a focus on the outcomes they're driving, and then they're also quite strategic about using that measurement to, improve investment decisions and kind of use it as an impact optimization lever. So we bring these three elements together through one of the key graphics in the paper, which we're calling the climate X-ray. And so even though this graphic might be a little hard to digest initially, I think what we're trying to show is kind of this three-dimensional layer of having high intentionality, high contribution, and a high measurement focus as investors kind of build their climate impact investing strategies. So our hope is that in today's conversation, you'll see how these different panelists are harnessing these best practices in both kind of the development of their strategies, as well as in the specific tools and frameworks and standards that they're leveraging as they begin to implement and operationalize these strategies. So I'll close my remarks there and hand it back to you, Jane.
Thank you, Claudia. I think that is our first 3D graphic in Tideline Thought Leadership, so a milestone. We are very fortunate to be joined today by an experienced group of climate impact investors and practitioners, and I'm pleased to introduce our group now. Carrie Browder is joining us. Carrie is Director of Project Frame at the Prime Coalition, and Project Frame is a collaborative effort by investors to build tools and best practices that accelerate solutions to reduce GHG emissions. Kelly Goddard is Chief Sustainability Officer, Brookfield Renewable and Transition. And Kelly's responsibilities extend across Brookfield's very large renewable and transition platform and include the Brookfield Global Transition Fund, which is the largest decarbonization vehicle raised to date. Irina Markina is Director of Impact and Sustainability at ARA Partners, a leading private markets investor, which is replacing incumbent processes with low carbon approaches. And Nicola Mustatea, who is Director of Climate Change at British International Investment, the UK's DFI. And Nicola leads BII's climate strategy there. So thank you all for joining us. And one logistical note before we get to our questions, we hope all of you joining us will submit questions as well. Please do so by putting them into the Q&A tool, and we'll reserve time for the panelists to get to as many of those as we can towards the end of our time together. So with that, we'll jump into our questions, and we thought we'd start with some questions around sort of high-level strategy and approach to climate impact investing. And if I may, I'd like to start with you, Carrie. Have a somewhat basic but very important question, which is, what is climate impact investing based on your experience and from your vantage point at Project Frame? What does it mean in terms of an investment strategy to call yourself a climate impact investor?
Wonderful, thank you. And I'm so happy to be here with you all and my fellow panelists. At Prime Coalition, we consider ourselves a catalytic investor, and I think we would categorize based on your paper as a climate-focused investor, because we lead with impact being ultimately what guides our decisions for where we put our capital. In Project Frame, we're about 200 members across 80 venture capital and private equity firms, and they run the gamut of different types of investors as far as their investment ethos. But what brings us together is how we can better articulate and assess what we call forward-looking impact. So how you can make investment decisions today that you can quantifiably measure mitigating GHG emissions in the future. And so for me, what I would consider a climate investor are those who are dedicated to going through the methodology of deciding where they think they can have the most climate impact, and then managing their KPIs and metrics throughout the investment life cycle. So they're not just looking at financial returns, but showing the reduction in GHG emissions over time. And I really think having a methodology and being willing to show your data, whether it's within your team, the community, or your LPs, really differentiates those who are just calling themselves climate investors and those who are willing to be more transparent and prove how they plan on delivering those results.
Thank you. Certainly, intentionality and measurement are helping us understand how those are elevated. Kelly, turning to you, one of the key elements, of course, as we've just heard in impact investing, is intentionality. Another is contribution. Would you tell us how Brookfield approaches those elements? And also, as discussed in the Truth in Climate Impact paper, Brookfield has reported that impact management has helped to enhance your investment process. And I'd be curious to hear a bit about how that has happened.
Great, sure. Well, just to start off, thank you for having me today. I just want to say congratulations on the Tideline report. I think, Claudia, as you said, it is a very important, if not the most important subject globally today, climate and associated impact investing. And I think the report does a really good job of simplifying it. And it's a very complex and perhaps sometimes opaque ecosystem. So I thought you did a great job of distilling it down to the key characteristics needed to achieve impact in this space. So well done, and great to be here and see Brookfield featured in the report, and with my fellow panelists, Nicola, Irina, and Carrie. Just a few words about Brookfield. Brookfield Asset Management is a leading alternative asset manager. We have about 750 billion of assets under management, and that's across real estate, infrastructure, renewable power, private equity, and credit. I think, Jane, as you mentioned, we've recently launched and are now well underway in implementing our inaugural impact fund, and that's called the Brookfield Global Transition Fund, or you'll hear me refer to it as BGTF. And this is, as Jane said, the largest currently private fund dedicated to accelerating decarbonization. We do this through a few key aspects. One is investing in emissions. We say we go towards the emissions and then work to drive those to net zero. The second is investing in adding additional renewable capacity to the grids. And the third is investing in sustainable solutions. Those technologies or businesses that are supportive or adjacent to the energy transition, such as CCUS. So just to the question on intentionality and contribution, I'll start with intentionality. When we were setting up the fund, there were really three key aspects that we were considering. And that was really playing to our strengths and capability, to putting impact at the heart of our strategy. And the third is embedding impact across everything we do. So thinking about the first one, I would say that it's important for any impact fund, whether climate or other impact fund, that it's credible. And I think in order to be credible, it needs to be supported by the necessary capability and experience to deliver against it. So when we were setting up BGTF, we really looked at our capabilities and experience. And we do have a long-standing history of infrastructure and renewable investing in operations. For example, our renewable business is one of the largest globally. We have 24 gigawatts of installed capacity, and we have a development pipeline of over 100 gigawatts today. So we really wanted to leverage that expertise, our knowledge of the power markets and stakeholders, for example, our ability to access capital, and really focus on that. And that led us to establishing a fund fully dedicated on decarbonization. We thought that would position us to have the biggest impact. I think the second key criteria we were looking at is we wanted to establish impact at the heart of our strategy. And we did this by setting a dual mandate at the front of our fund. And that is accelerating the global transition, as well as delivering strong risk-adjusted returns to our investors. So impact is at the heart of what we do. It's not something parallel or separate. And I think that's really important for us. And the third area is embedding impact throughout the life cycle. And we do that through developing and executing an impact management and measurement framework. And this includes screening investments at the front, which is really important to us. We do that through what we call a 4A criteria assessment. For example, I think Claudia said the details are important, so I'll share a bit of the details here. And just on those 4As, the first is alignment. We need to ensure that each of our investment can be put on a Paris-aligned plan. The second is around additionality. We believe that, it's important to invest in opportunities where we can be the active catalyst for impact. So each of our investments must provide additionality to what otherwise would have occurred. Accountability, we want to ensure that there's accountability both in emissions and impact reporting, but also that the business plans incorporate those targets and the associated governance is in place to deliver against those. And the fourth A is around avoidance. We really wanted to ensure that we were assessing and mitigating and avoiding other wider material ESG risks. So I would say that's how we screen our investments. In terms of contribution, we do actively then set impact targets, and these are quantified, transparent, and verifiable targets. And then throughout the life cycle of the investment, we develop Paris-aligned plans, and we work with the management teams to actively work to deliver against those targets. We also have a robust reporting process. We regularly review and report on our progress against our metrics and reporting. And I think to your question, lastly, Jane, about how has this really enhanced the impact, the IMM enhanced our investment proposition, I would say it has completely. And I think it's because, those three aspects, playing to our strengths and our capability, having that dual mandate and being very clear about that, and through implementing impact across all we do, means that this has allowed all of the teams in the fund to be involved, and that's including investment, finance, operational teams, and they feel ownership of this, and that enables to identify opportunities to both drive value and to deliver impact. So stop there.
Thank you. That detail is really interesting and helpful, and a good segue, Arena, to you. You're also a leading climate asset manager in the private market space using the impact label. And so my question similarly to you is what does impact mean to ARA, and how do you integrate that into your investment strategy?
Thank you, Jane, and thank you for having ARA at this event. I also want to commend the team on an excellent report. I think it's very important to increasingly offer additional analytical tools to capture the impact investing space, which is constantly evolving, and we'll see more and more players emerging. So your analytical approach and your 3D framework, I think, contributes a lot to understanding of that space. At ARA, we focus on industrial decarbonization. Our fund focuses on equity investments in process technology rollouts and as well as decarbonization enablers that can deliver 60% or greater greenhouse gas emissions reduction at product or service level. We believe that we are focused on the emissions that need to be reduced today. And here's why. Industrial sector, which is the focus sector for ARA, accounts for the greatest amount of global emissions, 40%. It is also estimated that $9.2 trillion need to be flown into the market to ensure global net zero by 2050. Emissions are largely focused in the industrial sector. However, even with the increase of sustainable capital, we believe that this sector is underfunded. So far, majority of the investment flows have focused on early climate ventures or later stage infrastructure investments. Our focus is on an underserved market. We integrate impact in our investment lifecycle through a very specific impact objective of 60% greenhouse gas emissions reduction. So we assess each and every investment against that threshold. At the sourcing and due diligence stage, we identify specific industrial sectors in which we invest. These are 4 sectors: chemicals and materials, green fuels, energy efficiency, food and agriculture, manufacturing, and industrial services. So we assess each investment against those decarbonization sectors. And then for each investment, we estimate specific impact outcomes. We define 3 pathways for impact: emissions reduction, waste efficiency, or additional auxiliary emissions the impact reduction pathway. And in that context, we see that some businesses may fall only in one specific pathway, or some may be a winning trifecta across the three fields. I'll stop here and see if you have any questions.
Well, thank you very much. One of the certainly themes of the report and our conversation is about being concrete and data, and it's really interesting to hear the comments from you and earlier that are just very concrete and specific about your objectives and your measurement. So I'll turn to you, Nicola, as an investor that's focused first and foremost on development. Would you describe for us, please, BII's approach to climate finance, and also what's been learned through a very long history of impact management at the organization that you've been able to pull into the climate vertical?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jane, and thanks for having me as well. So I think, as you said, British International Investment, and formerly known, as CDC Group. I mean, development, is really at our heart. I mean, the dual mandate of, creating impact, and the financial return is really core to what we core to what we do. And also in more recent years, I think we also became, the UK government's principal provider of climate finance as well in emerging economies. And therefore, I think there's a key role, for impact investors, development finance institutions to really demonstrate how you can bring climate and development objectives really closely together. And I guess from that perspective, at least in my view, the distinction between like a development finance institution and a climate finance institution is really over, I would say, in terms of the climate emergency that we're facing. And I think all investors and impact investors in particular have to really think about how, we can support really the economic transformation that's required across all sectors, to decarbonize, but also improve resilience. And therefore, I think a key point for us as we developed our climate strategy and our approach was to really seeing climate change, both from a risk but also an opportunity perspective, as integral, to our dual mandate of impact and return. The other point I just wanted to mention is because I think Kelly mentioned the investment cycle as well. So our impact management approach, is grounded in the operating principles for impact management, and obviously bringing in climate into that perspective and thinking about how we can maximize climate impact, across the entire investment process is absolutely key. The other point is that climate is a key thematic strategic impact objective in our new 5-year strategy, which is around, productivity, inclusion, and sustainability. And here on the sustainability part, which is very much around the climate objective, I just wanted to highlight again this point around economic transformation. And I think what it requires is more climate finance, so more finance and financial flows into climate solutions. But we also need to make sure, we work with also non-climate finance investments on reducing their emissions and improving their resilience, which is obviously a point that both Kelly and Irina made in terms of, all of these industrials, transport, everything basically needs to decarbonize, and we need to be a core partner in that sort of transition. So I think just to say, a key lesson has been this point around intentionality. We need to be very clear on what sort of climate impact we want to achieve. And that for us is around Paris alignment. And as I said, Paris alignment is about more climate solution finance, but it's also about supporting all sectors in that sort of transition as well. And another key lesson that I just wanted to mention is, again, the sort of embedding of climate into our broader impact management system. So we have a new impact scoring system. So every transaction that we have made since the start of this year is scored according to their contribution to productivity, inclusion, and sustainability. So it's very front and center of our kind of broader impact approach. And we also have impact dashboards that we use to kind of in detail assess the impact of our investments. Again, climate is integrated there as well. And I think really linking what we want to achieve in our climate strategy with our impact management systems, I think has been absolutely core to bringing those perspectives together.
Thank you, Nicola. That's very helpful. I'm going to turn it over to Claudia now for some additional questions for our group.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks everyone for those comments. I think they were super helpful in understanding how you're thinking about the development of these strategies. I think for the second part of the conversation, we're really eager to dive into how you're thinking about implementing and operationalizing those distinct strategies. And I think a theme across all of your comments was this focus on measurement and metrics. So particularly want to dive into that piece of it. And I might start with you, Kelly. I think you hit on the first two pillars around intentionality and contribution, and you started chatting about Brookfield's approach to metric selection and target setting. But can you just tell us a little bit more about how Brookfield approaches measurement of climate impact outcomes, and then also how you're implementing any standards or frameworks, either voluntary or not, in your framework?
Sure, thanks, Claudia. I would start maybe with the second question first. Our investment strategy, as well as our impact management and measurement framework, have been designed to align with leading impact and climate standards and frameworks. I think this is a real important point for credibility and for consistency. And this, as I mentioned before, this includes at the due diligence stage, reviewing each potential investment against the goals of the Paris Agreement. We also look at each investment's potential to contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals. We do embed the recommendations of TCFD, another really important framework and increasingly a regulation, across our investments, operations, and reporting. And this also includes conducting physical and transition risk assessments on each of the potential investments as part of due diligence. Coming on to your first question, hopefully I've captured that right, is how we approach measuring climate impact outcomes. So this is really important that first, we're thoughtful of how we set these impact targets, that they're credible. And again, in order to be credible, our view is that these need to be informed by science and leading initiatives. As I mentioned earlier, as part of the due diligence, we proactively identify the specific metrics and targets for each of the investment, and this will depend on the type of investment. And I'll just give a few examples based on our themes of our fund. I mentioned the first theme, which was decarbonization, again, going towards the emissions. For these, we do set carbon reduction targets. Again, this is important to reduce carbon, and it's important that the nature of this investment going towards the emission, that we set these targets, both interim and long-term targets, and that they are aligned with science based on scientific pathways and informed, including by the Science-Based Target Initiative, sector decarbonization approaches where those exist. I think for the second theme of our fund, which is renewable development, we set targets for renewable development generation. I mentioned one of the key criteria is additionality. So it is about investing in opportunities where we can add additional renewable capacity to the grid. And the third theme is about carbon solutions. And we look at companies or sectors that support the global transition. And so this will depend on the type of investment that is, but I'll give you an example. We've recently invested in the development of new CCS. So for those investments, our target is around carbon capture. And I think it goes without saying that it's important to set quantifiable targets, but it's also important to establish a baseline measurement against those targets at the time of investment so that you're able to track progress and, for us, additionality that our investors think captured. I think in addition to setting impact targets for each of our investments, we do report on greenhouse gas emissions for all of our investments, and that's across scope 1, 2, and material scope 3 emissions. And of course, this is in line with the greenhouse gas protocol. We do view that independent assurance is an important part of the step. So we conduct third-party assurance of our greenhouse gas emissions on an annual basis. And similar to Nicola, we also want to test the health of the system. So we are also signatories to the operating principles for impact management. And we conduct third parties an independent assessment of how we are meeting those principles of the OPIM framework. And we publish both of our own assessment and the party assessment. We will aim to publish this on our website, and ours is coming out hopefully in the next month or so. So I would say aligning with leading standards and frameworks is very important, and it's an important part of our strategy. It supports us to first define, to track, and then regularly report on our emissions and our impact targets in a consistent, recognized, and transparent way, which I think is really important.
Super useful, thank you. And I think your comments demonstrated how the different objectives that you're pursuing within those like 3 different focus areas really impact, again, how you're thinking about operationalizing and then measuring that impact. So it's super useful. Nicola, I might turn it to you now. I think you started speaking a bit about BII's impact management system, and I think the need for managing climate impact across thematic areas, not just in your climate finance kind of strategy. So I'm curious if you could speak to how you're seeing that the expectations for impact measurement and management practices are likely to be different in the climate space compared to maybe other areas of impact management, and how you see that this is changing kind of for your investees in emerging markets.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Claudia. So I think both very, very good questions. I mean, maybe I'll start with, I guess, the context of our investees, in the markets that we invest in. So we invest in, in Africa and South Asia and Southeast Asia. I mean, obviously, these sorts of countries, are most exposed, to kind of climate-related risks, and obviously have contributed, to the least to the problem, they are facing the most. But I think what we're really seeing in our investees is that there's an increasing, interest to consider climate change, as a risk, but also as an opportunity as well. And I think what's really interesting is that we see policy changes in some of our key markets as well. So if we, for example, look at Kenya, to Kelly's point around TCFD increasingly becoming regulation, and what we see in Kenya is that banks, for example, now also have to disclose climate-related risks, as well. And obviously, there's a broader trend to, falling technology costs, which makes green business models increasingly attractive. And I think what we wanted to do is also to get a sense, from our investees, so both the businesses that we invest in, the funds that we invest in, on how climate change actually affects their business, because that obviously informs how we engage with them, and what sort of targets we might want to set, what sort of metrics we might want to track. And I think the results were really interesting. I mean, around 68% of our investees said that climate change is already affecting their business today. And more than half basically said that climate change will affect actually the viability of their business, in the next 5 years. So very much from a commercial perspective as well. And therefore, again, to your point in the report around contribution, we want to be the sort of key partner in supporting our investees, to address some of these challenges, and therefore we try to support our investees in setting net zero targets and starting to track emissions, how they can work on resilience as well to the physical risk side, how they can improve their governments through implementing the TCFD recommendations as well. And therefore I think the sort of robust assessment of climate metrics, is relevant for all investments, not only, climate finance investments. So it's very much around tracking, again, similar to Kelly, emission reductions, for example, over time, as well as some other metrics, emissions avoided, and so on. Clearly, climate finance is also a big part of what we do. So over the strategy period, we aim to deploy 30% of our total commitments in climate finance, so those that make a really strong contribution to climate action. And I think these sorts of investments from an impact perspective really need to demonstrate the impact on an outcome basis that they really have on planet, but also on people, basically as well. So obviously on the mitigation side, we have the key metrics of emission reductions, avoidance, sequestration, but I also think these need to be complemented with the impact on people. So, how many more people actually gained access, for example, to clean energy, which is obviously a key challenge in the market as well. And the final point that I wanted to mention is where more impact metrics are needed and where we're also doing further work on is actually on adaptation and resilience. So given the fact that I guess physical climate risks are very context specific in terms of where they occur, how vulnerable the kind of broader context is, at the moment, adaptation and resilience from a climate perspective is mostly measured on an input basis. So how much finance is flowing to that sort of project, but not on an output basis, like what are you actually achieving? How much is resilience improving? And I think that's a key area where we want to see further work on. And it's also something we're taking forward on a more systematic basis with the Adaptation and Resilience Investors Collaborative that we established with some other DFIs and key partners, where this sort of metrics question is a key area for us to explore further. So yeah, I think we need to cover both the mitigation, adaptation, and resilience side in terms of the climate challenge and related metrics.
Super useful to hear the perspective from your investees as well. I think common thread is that these types of factors are increasingly important. And I think, again, we're seeing investors track across all types of investments, these types of factors. Irina, I want to turn it to you because I know that we've had a conversation a lot around what it means to distinguish between ESG and impact. And especially as scope 1 through 3 is a core ESG principle. How do you differentiate that a bit from kind of the impact angle? So can you just speak to how you at ARA are thinking about the difference between ESG versus climate impact management, and kind of what each term and practice means to you?
Thank you for an excellent question, Claudia. I think when it comes to ESG, we see ESG as a specific lens to assess sustainability of each investment based on E, S, and G metrics. So in the most narrow sense, we'll look for standards alignment discussed amongst the participants here. So we'll look at SASB materiality for specific sector-specific businesses. We'll leverage GRI, for instance, for waste metrics. We'll look at TCFD physical and transition risk. We also screen our investments for principal adverse impact indicators in the context of EU SFDR, as well as EU Sustainable Finance Taxonomy for technical screening criteria. So this and the universe of alignment with these standards, we consider this as an ESG framework and ESG approach and management of an investment. What is common here is the retrospective nature of all of the data that we look at. We'll look back at, say, prior years of data in alignment with these standards. When it comes to impact, we focus on outcomes, and this is more of a forward-looking analysis. We'll look at climate impacts across waste reduction, and alternative impacts potential on a forward-looking timeline. That means for our hold period, as well as up to 2030. So to give you a specific example, we would take an investment and align it with a specific pathway. And within that pathway, we'll look at that investment's potential to reduce emissions. We'll leverage LCA data at product or service level if it's not available. Otherwise, we use similar methodology to what a Project Frame and the team there uses, essentially looking at specific businesses' potential to save emissions. Now, this is very theoretical and conceptual, and I think it always helps when somebody shares an example. So let me share two specific examples. We have a business in a portfolio which recycles LDPE, low density polyethylene, and that really just stands for plastic bags. So the business recycles plastic bags. We estimated that the business's physical footprint, scope 1, 2, and material scope 3 emissions is around 300 metric tons, whereas based on 2,000 metric tons of LDPE waste recycled, the business in fact saves 3,000 metric tons, which far exceeds its physical footprint. So this is precisely the decarbonization and waste reduction example that we'll look to see. As we all know, plastic waste is a huge problem globally. I think in US, only 2% of LDPE waste is recycled. So these are the types of impacts that we look to achieve. Another example could be our portfolio company that recycles food waste. A portfolio company, Divert, takes food waste from grocery stores and then turns that food waste into renewable fuel. Then that renewable fuel is utilized for different sectors. So for instance, this could be added in hard to abate sectors in, say, truck transportation. So this is another example in terms of waste reduction, emissions reduction, but also added an additional pathway of food waste reduction. Food waste is a big challenge, and I think it's fantastic that there is a business that is protecting the value of food and finding another life for it.
Great. Those are great examples of thinking through how you're kind of distinguishing these impact metrics. And I think the point that you made early in your comments about really thinking about the impact, the forward-looking impact, and projecting out and being intentional at the outset about kind of what impact you're achieving is key to kind of what we've seen across all climate impact investors. So thanks for bringing that to light. And I actually think that's a great segue to Carrie. Curious from your perspective as both an investor as well as kind of the developer and head of Project Frame. Where do you see the biggest gaps in the market today in terms of climate impact measurement and management? And what do you think is needed from us as an industry to address those gaps?
Thank you. I think you touched on a lot of it in the paper, but my perception just based on Frame alone is some of the things are very basic. The fact that we all tend to use different interpretations of the word additionality, for example. So Kelly mentioned it and how they use it in their practice. We have a very specific way of using it at Frame to meet regulatory requirements. And when it's very confusing, both as an investor and LPs who are interested in investing their money, distinguishing who is using the practices that they would like to align with and would trust investing their capital. So I think language is really important. And as part of Project Frame, we're working with investors who are both who consider themselves impact first versus others who I would call finance first, but impact curious, and helping them sort of define how they want to use certain language in their assessments and in their reporting. So that's one. The big one is the methodology. Like, how do you establish your baseline scenarios? What data are you using? There's a question about data in the chat. And I think as part of Project Frame, last year, sort of the top line, like how to set a baseline, how to develop a theory of change around impact was stage 1. We're currently in stage 2, which is what I would consider the 201 paper. So how do you both decide how to qualify what the impact of a technology would be, and then think through all the different effects, both positive and negative, that one technology could have. And then you go into establishing the baseline for each of those effects and like measuring up to what you think the potential impact could be if you're talking about a super early stage VC style investment or planned impact. And that's when you know what the total addressable market would be. And being able to compare. So if you had all of us here as investors, if we could get to the point where we could line up sort of our impact methodologies and show how we did it, where we got the data for the baseline, what we consider reliable data, it'll be a lot easier to compare apples to apples and then ultimately scale solutions that we think are important to the transition to a cleaner economy. And then another thing that I don't think was mentioned in the paper, but I believe is really important, is investing in the talent itself. We are all here because we are passionate about this and we have lots of questions, but there aren't many offices that have people dedicated to impact within their office, or sometimes you contract out, which is still fine. But as part of the data and tools working group within Project Frame, we're trying to find opportunities to bring talent up, train people, but also develop a repository of who are the trusted like third-party actors or contractors that we believe we would refer to other investors to help them understand their impact in-house and then articulate it externally. But to get to some of the questions out there, I wanted to do a little plug for a tool that we invested in called Crane. It's open source, public access, but for those who don't have sort of an impact team in-house, we think it's a great way for a lot of finance first investors to look at a specific technology and try to decide what is their good, better, best scenario. And it is true, when you don't have a lot of data or you don't have a counterfactual, you're sort of it is much more challenging. However, the truth is that there are data sets out there that we consider reliable and that we can use to sort of support our claims about the impact that we think we could potentially have if investing in a solution. So I'll put the tool in the chat, but I think that that's a way to sort of see where the baseline scenarios are coming from, because the links to the data sets are included. And we hope to really expand upon that through the Data and Tools Working Group in Project Frame, so we can build a repository that us as a community feels that we could use together.
Great. Thanks, Carrie. I think you hit on a lot of the points that we're hearing around the actual implementation of this, the governance around it, the teams and staffing. So super useful comments. Jane, I'll turn it to you, I think, to gather some of the Q&A from the audience.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we have quite a few questions. A number are around data and measurement. So maybe we take a couple of those, and Carrie, you hit on one of them, but I think it's worth spending a few more minutes. So there are, one of the questions is around how do we have enough information to make assumptions, to set targets, to do baseline scenarios? How can we get comfortable with the information we had and tools we have right now to do that? So be interested to hear from others as well about how you think about the projections and the environment to make projections. And maybe I'll wrap in another question, which is about how you source data, and we heard a bit from a couple of you about that, but would be interested in any thoughts on how you are sourcing data to ensure quality and integrity there. So I'll open it up to see if anyone would like to jump in on those.
Maybe can jump in on the question on sourcing data, because I think that's quite an interesting one, and particularly obviously in the sort of emerging market context that we invest in. So I guess from our side, I mean, we invest both directly and indirectly. So directly in companies, for equity and debt, but also intermediated through funds and financial institutions as well. We mainly do this, in unlisted basically entities. So, it's not for us, the sort of data providers are not that relevant. So then the question is, how do we source the sort of relevant data? And I would say on our direct investments, what we found really useful is the kind of data hierarchy that was explained by the PCAF standard, so the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, which basically gives you a sense of what sort of data to ask for as a priority, ranging from obviously actual, emissions data to fuel consumption by the business, which they normally should have, because obviously it's also a big cost driver as well. And failing that, if you don't have that, you can use the revenue data of the business and then apply a sector-specific emissions factor, which at least gives you a sense where it could be. Obviously, it would be better to have some primary data. So we found that sort of standard and the data hierarchy it sets out really helpful, and we actually have almost complete coverage in our direct investments on the kind of sort of primary data side. And then on the indirect portfolio, I think that's where it becomes more difficult, because obviously we invest in financial institutions and they might have, thousands of loans. So it's not like, they're collecting the data on each of their for borrowers. And a kind of tool that we developed with the Dutch Development Bank, among others as well, FMO, is called the Joint Impact Model. And this is a tool that allows you to, again, put in sector and country data of your investments and estimate emissions based on that. So for example, where we invest intermediated, we put the sector and country information of the underlying portfolio to get the emissions estimate. And I think it's a really useful tool to at least see where in your portfolio, most of the emissions concentrate. And then that, I think, can then be the starting point to set any sort of targets on reduction. So I just wanted to mention that.
I mean, I would say, Nicola, very well said. I think for greenhouse gas targets and emissions, and including avoidance, it's quite well established. And Nicola said it well, but I think both in the tools Nicola mentioned, but also in the grid factors. So when you're developing renewable energy, it's quite well established on how additional renewable affects the grid, and you can calculate avoided emissions. I think the one area that, I think is in development now and rapidly in development is about how do you set targets against those baselines. And I mentioned the Science-Based Target Initiative sector decarbonization approaches. There's those that are in place for several sectors, but there's still those that are in development for others. And we expect to see those come into place soon. That being said, there is a cross-sector pathway, which gives you a view of overall how much emissions need to be reduced, about 40% across the economy by 2030, and clearly to net zero by 2050. So I think within the ecosystem, there's a lot to go on in terms of greenhouse gas and climate. I think where it gets a bit less straightforward is on the wider ESG baselines and impact targets. There are, certain developments in this. IRIS Plus is a framework to help establish wider ESG impact targets. But again, it's important to know the baseline you're working for those as well.
Thank you. So we have a couple of questions interested in how you think about targets beyond emissions. And I think we've addressed this a little bit, but I'd be interested in thoughts from the group on how you're thinking about, for example, system change potential, kind of structural decarbonization. Also a question about intersectionality with climate justice. So would be interested in thoughts on, Carrie, you putting your thoughts on these other types of targets and goals.
I'm happy to go first on that because it's something that we're really passionate about at Prime, sort of figuring out how do we achieve the world we want to see, not just a livable climate. And I believe our director of impact is actually on the call, Anna Goldstein, who leads this work. But we developed something called Pathways of Change. So sort of it's like a beautiful mapping exercise where you think through what are the different pieces that we would need to see to create a more systemic investing approach for the world that we want to see, and then attaching KPIs and metrics to those achievements, and then figuring out, is it an investment program, or in our case, since we're a nonprofit, is it a different sort of nonprofit program to get us to that point? And even though we are passionate about figuring out how to have more intersectionality in our investments, we haven't done it yet. So I think what's a really exciting, we are in a really exciting time where we're sort of reaching out to others who do more social types of investments, talking to the environmental justice community, and figuring out how, as Prime, through our different programs, whether it's an investment program or whether it's a different program that isn't exactly like direct investments, but supports the community, how can we do that in a way that is thoughtful and is attached to metrics that we can prove, since that's part of our ethos. And so I was glad to see that question in the chat.
Thank you, Carrie. I'm noticing the time and noting that we just have a couple minutes left. I think I'm going to turn to our final question for the group, and I'll ask the same question to each of you, which is, what is a step that you've taken in climate impact management or would recommend others take that you believe has most strengthened your position as a climate impact investor? And I'll ask you to go in the order on my screen, which is Nicola, followed by Carrie, and then Kelly, and last word to Irina. So Nicola, I'll turn that to you. One step to
Yes,
be a world-class climate impact investor.
Yeah, I think that's the sort of magic question. So thanks, Jane, and also for a really good session, I think, with my fellow panelists. I think it's really great to hear. So I think the one step that I would say in terms of climate impact investing is to really embed it into the institutional governance and processes. And that can have several sub-steps, but I think that needs to be the starting point. So that ranges from embedding it in management and board responsibilities, to integrate it into your risk systems and making it a really core part of your impact framework across the investment cycle. So I think the embedding it where you can across the institutional governments and existing systems, and making clear that everybody has a role to play, I guess, across these different teams that deliver on impact investing is crucial.
That's great. Thank you. So Carrie, to you.
I would say being willing to fail forward. I think especially in venture capital, everyone wants to have an edge, and there is always the chance that several of your investments don't make it. And I think if we're going to really make a difference for scaling climate solutions, we need to be honest with each other about what went well and what didn't and why. So we don't have to keep repeating the same mistakes because we weren't willing to share what didn't work. And I'm happy to see more transparency as we're growing as a frame community, especially in the climate space.
Terrific. Kelly?
Hard to follow both of those. So I would say get started. I think what we realized is it is a global imperative, but it is also a very large investment opportunity. And we banter around numbers like trillions. And we've seen what we had an initial close for the fund. We raised more than that. We raised more than that again. So there is a huge pull for this, as well as a huge importance to it. But I would say when you get started, it's important to think about what capability you can bring again in order for it to be effective and credible. And as I said, put it at the heart of the strategy, as opposed to a separate objective of your investing strategy.
Thank you. And Irina, to you.
Thank you, Jane. I think once you get started, as Kelly said, what was most important for us, setting a very specific investment thesis, having that very specific 60% threshold truly drives all of our investment activity, as well as operational activity. We have around 38 industrial facilities currently being scaled, and I think this is the guardrail against which we work. This also drives all of our sourcing, all of our diligence. Having a very clear impact management system that helps to execute that 60% threshold is also very important. So I would say defining that thesis and using this across the investment life cycle and socializing this across all teams within the fund has been the most impactful thing we have done.
Thank you all. Those are really great words of wisdom to wrap up with. Accountability, taking risk in a smart way, strong integration, and clarity around your thesis are just kind of fundamental approaches. So wonderful words of wisdom. So on behalf of Claudia and me and Tideline, thank you to our panelists and to all of you who've joined us today. And we hope to see you on another Compass series soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Everyone.